Welcome, everyone. I'll give you a few seconds to get into the webinar here. My name's Johnny. I'm one of the admissions counselors here at Stony Brook. All right, now it looks like quite a few of you are popping in, so I'll go ahead and introduce today's presenter. We have Professor Virama from the Department of Ecology and Evolution here to talk about today's event called What's in a Barbarian's DNA. So I'll pass it along to him and he can get started with today's presentation.
Okay, thank you. Just share the screen. So hopefully you can see my screen okay and hear me. I'll take that as yes. So hi, my name is Krishna. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of the kind of work that we do at Stony Brook in my lab in the Department of Ecology and Evolution. And in particular, I'm going to tell you about work we use where we try to understand ancient DNA in medieval populations. In particular, very interested in what happens after the Roman Empire when it's supposed to be that many, as we'll get to, barbarians kind of took over the continent. You'll have to bear with me. I had my COVID vaccine yesterday and I thought I'd escape the effects, but they are definitely kicking in, so it may be a little slow, but hopefully we'll get through this fine. So when I think about my first exposure to the word barbarian, it really comes from this fella here, Conan the Barbarian, who was a fictional character played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. You can see here him punching a camel, and you can get the kind of idea of what people thought of barbarians from this clip when they asked Conan what his view of life is.
Wrong! Conan, what is best in life? To crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and to hear the lamentation of their women. That is good. That is good.
So the idea of a barbarian, from my perspective, initially as a child, was barbarians are the people, the savage people that lay waste to culture and society and civilization, often the bad guys in many scenarios. And that hasn't really changed today. For example, if you play the game Civilization, you can take control of many different cultures and civilizations from across the world, the Romans, the Greeks, Egyptians, British, Americans, and you can kind of take those cultures and civilizations and bring them to fruition. However, what you always end up being fighting against at the beginning, you have no choice, are barbarians. I'll show you this here.
Look out for barbarians in Sid Meier's Civilization 6. In this video, we'll show you how to face down the first threat to your growing people. The first enemies you face in Civilization 6 are barbarians. You can't befriend them, you can't reason with them, you're going to have to fight them.
So that is the image of barbarians that's lasted for a number of years. And this actually goes back not just decades, but centuries. And you might think, well, why does that matter too much? You know, these are games, movies. Barbarians is just a useful way to describe people, but it actually does have serious ramifications in the fact that barbarians are often used as a kind of metaphor for describing the destruction of today's world and by people from the outside. For example, Geert Wilders is a far-right politician in Holland, the Netherlands, and so he directly uses this as a metaphor. In the 5th century, the Roman Empire fell to the Germanic barbarians, and here he's talking about Muslims moving into modern Europe. Similarly, in the United States, Pat Buchanan has described the same kind of idea that civilization is being destroyed by people from the outside, in this case, Hispanic individuals, and destroying Western civilization as we know it. So these are the kind of, you have these kind of caricatures, and they do play a part in modern political discourse and how we think of all sorts of political and societal issues. Now, when we're talking about barbarians, there are many different types of barbarian. in how they're described. The one I'm really talking about, and certainly the one that's being used in this political discourse, are the barbarians that lived on the outskirts of the Roman Empire. So at its peak, the Roman Empire kind of covered all of this area of Europe, parts of the Near East and Africa, huge swaths of land. And then there was this area just north of the Rhine and the Danube called Germania, where we have all sorts of mysterious tribes with all sorts of different names that we really didn't know too much about, and we don't know where they really lived. We just know they lived across the river, those big rivers. While we know a lot about the Roman Empire, and we know all the divisions and how those divisions change through time. So where do we get this information about barbarians that kind of lend to these kind of caricatures and political statements? Well, they come from primarily two sources. One, unsurprisingly, is historical text. So this is the kind of beginning of when we start to see people doing history using written texts, primarily written by Greeks and Romans and clergy, describing what is happening in the world around them. That's kind of the first time we see what we would call the historical era. Historical really starts with textual evidence. These primary texts have been turned into very famous books like Edward Gibbon's Fall of the Roman Empire, which is still a very important text for what we think happened. And then the other aspect is archaeology. So digging into sites both before and after these periods, looking at kind of the buildings. So here we have these kind of mosaics that appear in the Roman villas. So we start to learn about how people lived, and also their graves and the fact that people would bury themselves with all sorts of grave goods. And that is what archaeologists use to understand these societies. And then when we think about the barbarians, our first textual evidence of what they're like, this kind of caricature again, actually comes from Julius Caesar. So he says the Germans, and here he's talking about these Germanic barbarians from Germania, whole life is occupied in hunting and in the pursuits of the military art. From childhood, they devote themselves to fatigue and hardships. Those who have remained chaste for the longest time receive the greatest commendation among their people. They think that by this, their growth is promoted. By this, the physical powers are increased and the sinews are strengthened. It is the greatest glory to the several states to have as wide deserts as possible around them, their frontiers having been laid waste. They consider this the real evidence of their prowess, that their neighbors shall be driven out of their lands and abandon them, and that no one dare settle near them. And so this is our first kind of real description of barbarians. And you can see it's really many of the themes that we see in both the game, Conan, those texts are there, there's the kind of roots for them. Now, what is particularly interesting is not just what we think of barbarians as they're living outside the Roman Empire, but what happens when the Roman Empire starts to decay and fall. And that's obviously the common metaphor. So at some point, the Roman Empire starts to get kind of unwieldy. It divides into western and eastern parts. And then there are the Hunnic invasions by Attila the Hun that set off a chain of events that many describe as kind of the starting point of the fall of the Roman Empire. And to many people, the textual evidence we have from that point in time, this is the worst thing you could ever have imagined could happen to the world. For example, Jerome in 409 AD writes, "The brightest light of the whole world is extinguished. Indeed, the head has been cut from the Roman Empire. To put it more truthfully, the whole world has died with one city. Who would have believed that Rome, which was built up from victories over the whole world, would fall, so we would be both mother and tomb to all people?" So this was really the end of civilization. And in particular, what appears to happen as the Roman Empire falls, you'll see many kind of maps of barbarians moving from Germania into the Roman Empire. You see all these names and arrows, Walden, Lombards, and Anglo-Saxons moving in here. And it's just this dizzying array of migration into the area that's supposed to have decimated the existing civilization and kind of started the kind of Dark Ages. And this is often called the migration period of Europe. And many times it's depicted as being incredibly violent. So for example, we have this description, quite a horrible description of what barbarians might do to you if you happen to be in a place that they were taking over. Some had their mouths forced open with poles and stakes. Disgusting filth was put in their jaw so they could tell the truth about their money. They tortured others by twisting cords around their foreheads and shins until they snapped. Devoid of mercy, they offered many people seawater, others vinegar, the lees of olive oil, fish sauce, and many other cruel things, while full wineskins were placed near their mouths. Neither the weaker sex, nor regard for the nobility, nor reverence for the priesthood softened those cruel hearts. On the contrary, when they caught sight of their some office holder of honor, their wrath of their fury was thereupon increased. So barbarians really bad. It wasn't a nice, gentle transition. If you were to read what the Romans and Greeks were saying, this was just terribly bloody and horrible. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, the map starts to look like this. You now have all these kingdoms developed from initially barbarian tribes that had lived in Germania, and these would actually go on to form the foundation of modern Europe. They kind of start to put in laws, and we see the development from that. So that is the kind of overarching idea of barbarians and the views of barbarians from those times. Just to give you a kind of, we're going to focus in now on one particular group called the Lombards, the Longobards, or the Longbeards. So the Longobards are, even by the standards of other barbarians, considered very vicious. And they were considered, they were named Lombards or Longbeards because they would have these long beards, long hair, and even the women apparently would kind of cover their hair and make them look like a beard, and they were particularly vicious. And they kind of pop up in the first historical descriptions in the 1st century, somewhere in Scandinavia. We hear a little bit about a group called the Lombards, and that's where that first name really comes from. Then they kind of disappear. We don't hear from them for a while, and suddenly, as the Roman Empire falls, they take over a group called the Lombards seem to take over an area called Pannonia, which is today's modern-day Hungary, Austria, Czech Republic, a former Roman province. And so they've established some time there. There, you can just kind of get an idea of the kind of stories. This is King Albion of the Lombards. They had at one point defeated the Goths, and he killed the Gothic king. And here he is presenting to the daughter of the king of the Goths, Rosalind, a skull full of wine, and that skull is actually the skull of her own father. So this is the kind of rhetoric we have for King Albion. Rosalind does get her revenge. She takes a lover that then goes on to kill Albion in her sleep. But still, that's the kind of group that we think about when we think about the Lombards or the Longobards. And then interestingly, is we don't actually have this for many groups. We have a very specific date where the Longobards appear to move from Pannonia into northern Italy, 568 AD. And from there, they actually establish a kingdom through much of Italy for almost 200 years. They really only didn't get Rome, but otherwise they pretty much had all of Italy. There are still places that are named after the Lombards today. So this was a very important group and past society. Here we have the kind of text that we have describing their movement, and it's by Marius Aventus, again, not someone who was themselves a Lombard, because barbarians didn't leave written texts. They had maybe some runic text, but they didn't leave any written text. They didn't really have that kind of that information. So everything we get is from other people, another point of view. And he says, in this year, Albion, king of the Longobards, with his army, leaving and burning Pannonia, his country, along with their women, and all of his people, occupied Italy in Farah. This word Farah, many people debated what Farah means. Does it mean military, kin, male clans? Really, we don't know. And we see Farah pop up in lots of historical texts. And there are some perished by disease, some by famine, and a few by sword. In that same year, they presumed to enter the frontiers of Gaul with a multitude of captives of this people were for sale. So here we have actual evidence, potentially from the historical text, of this migration in the migration period. So that's kind of promising. And then from an archaeological point of view, we have in certain places that you would associate with the time and place of the Lombards from the historical text, these S brooches that you find in graves. And you find them here in Pannonia, you find them in Italy, northern and southern, and it seems to track with this migration that's proposed in the text quite well. We even have a little bit of fragment analysis that suggests some Scandinavian is part of it. The problem you have with archaeology is that things can move that doesn't necessarily mean people move. Because if you look, this is just where some of the brooches are, but you actually find some of these brooches elsewhere. You find them more in Slovenia, you find them in Paris. And this is this kind of idea in archaeology that pots are pots. Pots are not people. Just because you see artifacts moving, that could happen because of trade. And so we don't really know much about migration actually happening and the numbers that will occur. So what we're really interested in as a genomics lab, we study DNA, is can we take the historical information, can we take the archaeological information, and can we add a new element, DNA? Can we take DNA from dead people who have been dead for 1,500 years and try and add new information? Because these texts, we aren't going to get many more texts. There are many graves, but there's a ceiling on what we can learn. Can we add this new information and change how we understand the migration period? And so that's what my lab has been working on for a number of years. And we do this by what we call ancient genomics or paleogenomics. And this comes from a major kind of technological development in the world of DNA sequencing, where we can now sequence genomes where it took $3 billion to sequence the first human genome, and it took 10 years. Now it takes $500, about an hour to sequence a genome. And not only that, we can go and we can get bones from these graves, and we can get little bits of bone powder, and we can get the DNA from the actual individuals that died. And then we can ask, are there differences between individuals from different places in the world? And we can ask, how are these people related? You can think the kind of 23andMe style ancestry, but we can do it on barbarians. So we started this multidisciplinary collaboration. We didn't want to just be the geneticist that did this. And we have a team of geneticists. There's people here in green. We have archaeologists here in yellow. They have access to the material. And then we have historians that know about the history. And the first step, the one I'm going to tell you about today, involves looking at two particular cemeteries that are associated with the Lombards. One from modern day Hungary called Zolard, which dates to the mid 6th century when the Lombards are supposed to be in Pannonia, and this is the region of Pannonia. And then we have another cemetery in northern Italy, Calenio, which is supposed to be from the late 6th to early 7th century when these barbarian Lombards are supposed to have moved and then established this Lombard kingdom. And so this is the cemetery, just to give you some idea of what Zolard looks like. This is the actual map, and we have all the artifacts here. And you can see there are men in blue, red are females. We have individuals with all sorts of grave goods, brooches, swords. You can see the excavation taking part. It was actually found when they were digging up a road. And Zolard lies just kind of south of Lake Balaton. It turns out there's a lot of ancient medieval sites here. So this was an area where there's lots of medieval populations. Now, the first thing we did, this was the first time anyone was able to get DNA from pretty much every single grave in a cemetery. And by doing that, we were able to tell within the graves who was related to who spatially, because it turns out the way people bury the dead tells you something about how they actually lived their life. And you can see this is the cemetery layout, and it's just represented here. And then we've drawn some gray kind of shaded areas where we found individuals that were related to each other biologically. We've called them kindred. We have this major kindred here, S1, kindred S2, 3, and 4. Now, this is the first time by using DNA you can actually tell who's related to who in an ancient cemetery. No one had ever done this before. And we can do even better than that. We can't just tell who is related to who, but we can tell exactly what their pedigrees are. And this kindred 1, it turns out, was this 3-generation pedigree where they'd all people who were biologically related and they were buried in the same place. And we can tell that there are certain individuals that were really high status. There are these male individuals, 24, 13, and 22, these 2 brothers and his kind of grandfather, who had a really rich protein diet. We could tell from isotopes. And this individual here in particular seemed to be really important. It was buried with scales and swords and even a horse without its head. And perhaps more interestingly, we have this nice pedigree that we'd reconstructed of this 6th century group. And there were only 2 women in this pedigree. They seem to be kind of missing. We were still not sure where they are. So it's a very male-dominated group. And so that was kind of really interesting that we see this kind of male kin groups, and immediately starts to think of what is this phara that was talked about in the text. The other cemetery we have is Colenio. And so Colenio is a very big cemetery, actually has 3 periods of occupation going from the late 6th to 7th century. And we were able to get pretty much everyone from the first period. You can see the kind of artifacts that individuals were buried with here. Here's the actual part, the skeletons, and we're similarly able to get DNA from them. And just like in Zollard, we found these really large related groups. We have now a Colenio kindred that's actually more spaced. So the first one, they buried them together all in one place in Zollard. Here we have 3 related groups, and they're all kind of in slightly different parts of the cemetery, but there's still this very big pedigree here, 3-generation pedigrees kind of spanning across the cemetery. We have another big pedigree here. And so this was really interesting that we find that biological relatedness seemed to be an important part of these cemeteries, these kind of ancient societies, which may seem obvious to you now when you think about, your family plots, but it wasn't actually so obvious that this was how people would be buried in medieval times. Now we have definitive proof that that was something that people were doing. Now, at a broader level, we could look at things that not just to do with how individuals were related very short term, brothers, sisters, cousins, things like that. We could look deeper, their ancestry. Now we start to move into that kind of 23andMe kind of style information. So this is a very famous analysis of modern Europeans. And each point here is an individual that was sequenced for their genome, and the relative distance between each of these little points reflects their genetic distance for their genome. And though no geographic information was put onto this particular analysis, we just painted them with where these individuals turned out to be from modern Europe. And you can see they actually cluster by modern geography. You can basically make a European map based purely on genetic data. Here we have Portuguese and Spanish, French, people from the UK, Italians. These guys here turned out to be Sardinians, Eastern Europeans. And you can kind of really, it's just an amazing kind of analysis that showed that people, perhaps unsurprisingly, tend to be more related and have sex with other people that are close to them. And that is reflected in today's modern European ancestry. If you're from England, you'll tend to be similar to other people from England. So then we asked, well, how do our medieval people from Zollard and Colenio look? And so here we have our PCA, or our ancestry plot that I just showed you. I've just kind of colored it a little different. We've got Northwestern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, etc. And then I'm going to show you where modern Hungary is. So pretty much everyone from modern Hungary has this ancestry that you would find here. Here you find where modern Italians are. So we would expect that if we're looking at just Zollard, this one tiny cemetery from Hungary, right? It's not from all across the country. It would be tightly clustered with Hungary. And similarly, Colenio would expect to be tightly clustered with Italians. That's actually not what we found. We found that when we looked at all these individuals from Zollard, the 40-odd individuals, they had ancestry where there are individuals that look like today's modern Scandinavians, Central Europeans, Southern Europeans, just incredible genetic diversity in this one small cemetery. And then we looked at Colenio and found the same thing. Individuals of lots of ancestry today you would find in Scandinavia, and lots of ancestry you'd find in Italy. Just more diversity than you would see in any modern population today, really, unless maybe you went to a really cosmopolitan city with lots of immigration. So you kind of have this north to south gradient. So we can actually paint these ancient genomes. So each bar here is an individual from our cemetery from Zollard, and we can paint them by how much northern ancestry or southern ancestry they have. So if they're a very blue bar here, that means that in particular individual had a very northern European ancestry. If they had a very red, they had lots of southern ancestry. They may have intermediate, and they may have Western European ancestry if they have this kind of greenish color. And we do the same thing with Colenio, and we can put that onto our ancestry map, and we can see there are clusters of individuals that would be considered northern, and clusters of individuals in Zollard and Colenio that would be considered southern. Now that's interesting that we have such diversity. But what is even more interesting is it's not randomly distributed across the cemetery. It turns out all these individuals here apart from one individual, have the northern ancestry in this part of Kalenyo, and all the individuals here have southern ancestry. And all these individuals of the northern ancestry, as well as being part of these big kinship, biological kinship groups, they're the ones that are buried with weapons. They're the ones that are buried with lots of jewelry for the women, lots of food, and their graves are really elaborate, this area of the cemetery. This part of the cemetery, they kind of pick graves. They don't have anything in them. Some people have suggested that maybe these are slaves from the southern part of Europe, and these are the kind of warriors from the northern part of Europe. However, you've got to be very careful, because with the Christianization of Europe, people didn't put grave goods anymore. So it could be that they were just a different culture. But clearly there are two different groups of people living together, burying their dead together, but they have very different cultural representations in their archaeology. And we can see that big kin group is mostly of northern ancestry. There was one individual that seemed to contribute something to the pedigree. And interestingly, this turned out to be an individual the archaeologist at the time had identified as being a little bit different archaeologically to the other women around. These are the circles that we see here with northern ancestry. They kind of had a more old-fashioned kind of jewelry, and they'd been called the Roman wife. And interestingly, they have a different ancestry, have an Italian-like ancestry, but they are part of this family that was living there and buried together. So we have this kind of mixing of different groups in live time. You can see it here happening in Zolad. Kalenyo, surprisingly, we saw the same thing. Individuals that were part of these big kindred tended to have this northern ancestry, had the weapons, had all the grave goods, and individuals of southern ancestry tended to not have many people that were related to them, had no grave goods. So we see the same pattern in Zolad all the way in Hungary as we see later in Kalenyo. So there's really very similar kind of practices in these two cemeteries. When we look at this kindred one, we see this very blue again, like I said, this one that's spanning across long parts of the cemetery. They have lots of artifacts, but then interestingly, you have another family over here, kindred 2, which has a slightly different ancestry, and they have a very different type of artifacts. They still have swords, they still have jewelry, but they're different. The archaeologists could tell they were different. They would actually consider them Merovingian, French. It turns out their ancestry does look kind of French. What is even more interesting and starts to get at the idea of, are these individuals of northern ancestry migrants into Kalenyo, potentially from somewhere in Pannonia? We can do something called isotope analysis, where we can tell if an individual is local, was buried where they were actually born and had lived their life and consumed a particular diet, or if they came from somewhere else. If you're of southern ancestry in Kalenyo, you tended to be local. It's somewhere you were born and it's where you died. Individuals of northern ancestry that were part of these big kinship groups, there was mixtures of local people and people that actually came from somewhere else. And it turned out if you divided them by where they were in the pedigrees, it's the oldest individuals in our pedigrees that tended to be the non-local individuals, 93, 102, and it's their children that were local. So it looks like we have individuals of northern ancestry coming from outside into Kalenyo and then establishing new families with this kind of northern-like ancestry. Obviously, that starts to get the mind going about migration of Lombards from Pannonia. And we may ask, for example, are the big kinship groups, these big kind of pedigrees of northern individuals from Kalenyo and Zolad with all the grave goods, the weapons, the beads, are these the Pharaoh that were being talked about in the historical texts, these kind of male-based clans that are all genetically related and kind of migrated from place to place? Is this what the Pharaoh are? And it wouldn't be a bad guess at this point, based on genetic data, to suggest that that's what's the case. It's possible that the bulk of the migrants were this related group of individuals, of men. Where the women are, we're still not sure, that moved from place to place, and they have this northern ancestry that's consistent with them coming from somewhere in Scandinavia. So it really fits the historical text very well. So we were very happy with the results, these early results that we've been getting. So just to summarize what we just talked about, biological relatedness was a really important part of social organization in these past societies. It wasn't the only thing, right? There were clearly other people buried close to some of these groups that were maybe other kinds of kinship, mothers, things like that, wives, husbands. But biological relatedness was an important part of these medieval societies that were migrating, these barbarian groups. But they weren't just these homogenous groups from the outside that were just kind of tightly related to each other. They were diverse. There was individuals of northern ancestry, southern ancestry, and they're all living together in these same cemeteries, in these same societies, burying themselves next to each other. And so that's kind of interesting. Show more diversity than you'd find in modern Europe. And we can see that even though they're living together, they're still keeping part of their culture through the grave goods that seem to correlate with their ancestry. And we're even finding a little bit of evidence, though it's still unfenced, of evidence of a migration that's described in historical texts and suggested by the archaeology. We can now start to see that with the genes. Okay, so that's the project I wanted to tell you about. Just to end very quickly, so my lab, we work on a lot of things. Basically, we do work with genomes, and we work on ancient DNA from barbarians and medieval populations, but we also do work on model systems. So we try and look at stickleback fish, Drosophila, fruit flies, we look at primate genomes. We combine that with a lot of computational tools. We look at big data. And our fundamental question is, can we understand how humanity's genomes evolved? We can do that by looking at ancient DNA. We can look at that by looking at fish, because it turns out there's a lot of similar genes in fish and fruit flies that we'll see in humans. And so we have people working on all sorts of projects, and this includes undergraduates. So currently we have 6 undergraduates in my lab. We've had many, many other undergraduates in the past, and they do all sorts of projects. And they're involved, some of them are involved in the ancient DNA, some are involved in the fish. I'll just highlight 2 individuals. Oh, my dog is coming down. Mark Milhaven, this is the kind of thing that people tend to go on to if they contact me and they become part of the lab. He's now just started a new PhD at Arizona State. He worked for a couple of years in my lab while being an undergraduate. So we're very, so that's kind of something that people tend to do. And then I'd also like to point out Jonathan Gage, who is another undergraduate. He's now working at the New York Genome Center, where he's doing a lot of work doing the sequencing of COVID-19 patients. And I know that they're having just huge amounts of work at the moment. And so based on the experience he got in my lab and in our department, he was able to get that job at this New York Genome Center, fantastic new building, and kind of charitable company, and they're doing a lot of excellent work. And so I'd highlight that there. With that, I'll take any questions.
All right, we don't have anything yet in the Q&A. Students, if you have any last minute questions before we close out, feel free to submit something now. Otherwise, you can always email us in admissions. I'll drop the email address in the chat for you guys. All right, so it doesn't look like anyone has any additional questions. So like I said, if you have any questions you need to follow up with admissions about, or you want to get in touch, feel free to reach out via email. I want to thank Professor Virama for joining us today. It was an excellent presentation, and hopefully we can continue to work together on future events. Oh, actually, before we go, looks like there's one here quick. You can see that on your end, right?
Yeah, so I mean, the big thing has been this kind of development of sequencing technologies that has transformed what the amount of DNA we can sequence from, you know, a couple of thousand base pairs to the whole genome in one experiment. And that has just opened up all the questions that we can ask, not just in ancient DNA, but all species. And it turns out that this just has revolutionized the field. So now genomics is a field. So we have courses in genomics and genomic labs that are very recent because of that technological development.
All right, there's one more there. If the groups were from different parts of Europe, what language did they speak?
I mean, the problem we have, we don't know exactly what language was spoken, in particular from the barbarians. There's often used this word Germanic, which is supposed to be associated with the German language, but we don't really know because they didn't leave anything for us to tell. We just have what the Romans and the Greeks who were speaking Latin told us. And so we don't have a good idea of the actual language, despite them being described as Germanic. Many of the time you find if you go into the historical text, they weren't really speaking any kind of language that would resemble German at all. They were much more diverse than maybe the Romans and the Greeks were characterizing them.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I guess that concludes our event for today. I appreciate the students that came. And again, one last time, if you have any other questions, you can reach out by email, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.